Hey everybody, so today we're talking about cellular respiration, and we're going to look at that through the lens of human beings and the human body, which is why you see this anatomical looking background. So let's get started with what is cellular respiration? Well, you know about photosynthesis, and it turns out cellular respiration is the opposite. So let's take a look at photosynthesis. We had some things we needed. Those were water, energy from the sun, and carbon dioxide, CO2. And some things that we made, which were glucose, that sugar or the food, and oxygen gas. And it kind of looked something like this. We saw that we needed the sun, the water, which we got through the roots, and we exchanged carbon dioxide for this oxygen gas. Now, let's take a look at cellular respiration. What do we need? Well, the opposite. We need the things we made in photosynthesis, so glucose and oxygen. Now I bet you can guess what we make. We make some water, we make some energy, and we make some carbon dioxide. The only difference is that thinking reasonably here, the energy from photosynthesis, it comes from the sun, like you can see in this picture. Now, we in cellular respiration are not making sunlight. You will not glow as a result. But we're going to make a different kind of energy, and we'll talk about that in a bit. So, like I said, we've got this reversal in what we need and what we make. And we can look at that through the form of an equation. So, photosynthesis uses these ingredients to make these products. And if you just flip the equation around, you've got cellular respiration using the products of photosynthesis to make these molecules that were the reactants of photosynthesis. So we've just reversed our equations. Now, like I said, the energy is the only difference. The sunlight is what we use for energy in photosynthesis, and the energy we get as a result of cellular respiration is something you might have heard of before. It's called ATP, and we'll talk about that in a bit. So let's start with how do we get each of these ingredients? How do we get glucose into our bodies? What do you think? Something like that, right? We eat it. We have to eat our food. And so does this guy. So the digestive system has a key role in cellular respiration. These are some of the parts. It consists of mouth and teeth to break down the food or to start that process. The esophagus to transport our food down to the stomach and intestines where our food is absorbed. Now, where are these nutrients absorbed? They actually go into your blood. And the blood is going to carry them to places that need to make that energy by doing cellular respiration. So here's some parts. And what does this actually look like? Well, what we've got here is this food traveling down through the stomach. That's this structure. And it's going to do that after it moves down the esophagus once you've chewed it. Once it moves down through the stomach, then it's going to enter into the intestines. And the intestines are where this food is going to travel and eventually be absorbed into our blood. So this is kind of what that looks like. And to break it down for you here in words, we've got the process of chewing and using saliva and stomach acid to break down the food. Now, stomach acid, guys, is really nasty stuff. It is so acidic, and acids can just break things down, dissolve them, if you will. And so this is why, if you think back to that awful time when you maybe got sick and threw up, that's why your throat burns. It's because you've got this strong acid that's able to break down your food going into your throat, which is a place it's not supposed to go. So your stomach has this really harsh environment that helps dissolve those foods you eat and break them down into useful nutrients. Then the nutrients are absorbed into the blood, and that happens mostly in the intestines. So that's our digestive system. But how do we get oxygen? Well, we breathe, right? So this is why, so when you go outside and it's cold and you can see your breath, which gas is that? Think for a second. Is that carbon dioxide or oxygen? So that gas you breathe out is carbon dioxide, but we use breathing in order to get the gas we need, oxygen, into our lungs and release the gas we make, carbon dioxide, out of our lungs. So let's take a look at this system, the respiratory system, which is going to help us accomplish that goal. So the nose and mouth are used to inhale oxygen. The trachea is this tube that transports oxygen to our lungs. And in the lungs, oxygen diffuses or moves into the bloodstream. Now the reverse is true too. Once we're done with cellular respiration, we make some carbon dioxide, and that's going to have to get out of our bodies, and that's going to happen by going back to the lungs via the bloodstream and being exhaled out of the nose and mouth. Now, what does this system look like? Well, here's the lungs expanding and contracting as this person breathes in oxygen gas and out carbon dioxide gas. But if we zoom in a little bit, we can see here's the lungs, but they're made up of these tissues that contain these tiny little air sacs called alveoli. Now, if I zoom in even more, I can look and see how alveoli, which kind of look like raspberries if you ask me, they're made of these tiny little sacs that are next to blood vessels. So what happens is when we breathe in, we've got this high concentration of oxygen in the lungs, in the alveoli. And oxygen's going to go from that place where it's crowded and move into the blood vessel where it's not as crowded, and then it's going to get transported around the body. So oxygen moves into the lungs where we have these alveoli sacs, and then it diffuses into our blood vessels. Now, if we want to see that in action, you can look here. Oxygen gas is this red molecule, and you can see that this is the alveoli, and the oxygen moves into the alveoli. Look, those red molecules move in. And the purple molecules are carbon dioxide. So once we're done with cellular respiration, those should be moving from the blood vessel out, back to the alveoli where they can be exhaled. This is another way to look at that picture. If we imagine this is your lung tissue and these are your blood cells. So as this oxygen gas moves into the bloodstream, it attaches to these red blood cells, and then that's where it gets transported to the rest of the body. You can also notice that when blood cells do not have oxygen, they're a purple or blue color. And once they become oxygenated, for reasons that have a lot to do with chemistry, this molecule starts to get the red hue. All right, but where do glucose and oxygen need to go? Well, they need to go to a place called mitochondria. Now, mitochondria are parts of cells. So if we look at this picture, this is an animal cell, and you can see there's these little bits that if I zoom in, I see the organelle, or the part of the cell called a mitochondria. Now, this is where glucose will be broken down to release that energy, ATP. Some people like to call mitochondria the powerhouse of the cell. Why might that be? I'll let you think about that. And the last thing I want to mention about mitochondria is that some cells have a lot more than others. And that ends up depending on how much energy the cell needs. Does it do a job that requires a lot of energy? Or does it only need a few because it doesn't require as much energy? So what is this ATP stuff? Well, if I talk about the words that we abbreviate ATP, I'm talking about adenosine triphosphate. Okay, what does that mean? Well, like we said, glucose is broken down to release this energy ATP. And energy can be used to do work, like maybe moving. This might be your muscle cells for running, or it might be your heart. Your heart is a muscle and it needs energy to beat. It might be growing. You need energy in order for your cells to divide. Or it might be firing neurons. This sounds cheesy, but like the work you do just to like listen to this video is taking ATP. Like you're firing neurons. You're disrupting the networks of your misconceptions and making new conceptions. So that all takes energy. And energy is stored in this bond. We're getting into some chemistry here, but bear with me. Adenosine was in the name, and this is a molecule called adenosine. And we have 3 phosphate groups, abbreviated P, so that makes the triphosphate part. So adenosine triphosphate has some of these bonds between its phosphate groups. And if we break those bonds, we release a ton of energy. And so ATP is this molecule, it's a pretty big molecule actually, that is kind of like ready to go. Think of it as like some kind of battery where like it's got the energy, it's ready to do work, and all we have to do is break this bond and we release the energy to do the work. So we can look at this as kind of a cycle, and I'm not going to expect a huge amount of memorization on this, but if we break the bond between these phosphate groups of ATP, we break one of the phosphate groups off, we release some energy, and then we have this thing called ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate, or 2 phosphate groups. And if we put a little energy into this, which we're not going to worry about where that comes from, we can add a phosphate group back and we get our ATP molecule, and this can be reused. So the big idea is that ATP stores its energy in bonds, and when that's broken, we can do all these kinds of work, like heartbeat, growing, firing neurons, going on a run. That's the idea. So we know that glucose and oxygen need to get to the mitochondria, but how? Well, it turns out, I know this is a cheesy picture, but red blood cells love oxygen. And I'm not just kind of like being silly here. There's chemical reasons that oxygen really wants to bond to red blood cells. And so basically what we've got here is our circulatory system. Now, through arteries and veins, blood can carry oxygen and glucose from the lungs and intestines all around the body, wherever the energy is needed. So the heart keeps the blood pumping, keeps it circulating around the body, and then the blood is carrying these important molecules, the oxygen, the glucose to the cells, and carrying CO2 back when we're done with the cellular respiration. Well, what does that look like? Well, here's a picture that shows the beating heart, and it's showing you arteries in red. That's the circulatory organ that can carry oxygenated blood away from the heart. And then veins that carry deoxygenated blood back. And that's why these are blue. They don't have the oxygen. And we just need to keep in mind that blood is the thing going through these veins and arteries, and that's carrying these important molecules. So this is our circulatory system. The blood is helping important molecules circulate around the body. So in recap, we've got our digestive system, where we break down foods and absorb nutrients into the bloodstream. We've got our respiratory system, where we inhale oxygen. The oxygen travels to our lungs and is absorbed into our bloodstream. And remember, that's also the system that takes away the waste product, carbon dioxide. And then we've got our circulatory system. And this is how these important molecules like glucose and oxygen get around the body in order to be at the mitochondria of cells who need some energy. So Are there other systems involved besides the digestive, respiratory, and circulatory systems? Totally. Yeah, so like we talked about muscles being used to move and those requiring a lot of energy. So the muscular system would be kind of part of this indirectly. And there's multiple kinds of muscle, which I think is kind of cool. We've got the heart that beats. We talked about that. This is supposed to show like your skeletal muscle or the muscle attached to your bones that helps you move in ways that we're familiar thinking about, like running and whatnot. Um, but there's also muscle like in your intestines that expand and contract in order to push your food throughout your digestive system. And that's called smooth muscle. So the muscular system definitely requires a lot of energy. The other part I want to think about is this water that we make in respiration. Where does it go? Well, water is water, so it could be used anywhere in the body, but any excess water might be removed through the excretory system. Or it might become a part of lymph fluid, which is part of your combat to fight infections. And your lymph fluid carries things like white blood cells. And so maybe the water is going to become a part of the lymph fluid. So any of those systems really could be considered indirectly part of cellular respiration. But here's the big picture, guys. We've got our equation, which is just this summary of a process. We take these reactants, glucose and oxygen, and we make these products, water and carbon dioxide, and most importantly, ATP energy. And we can think about all the parts of the body systems that allow this process to happen. Now, it's important to remember that cellular respiration is not just a human being kind of thing. This is something that is going to happen in plants as well, because any organism that does things like growing, reproducing, maybe moving around, maybe making sounds, things like that that require energy, is going to have some way to break down food and produce that ATP to do work. So that's what I got for you as a cellular respiration overview, and now you should be set to start thinking about your cellular respiration modeling.